Before we begin, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps bring more soothing stories your way. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. The Las Vegas sun blazed mercilessly against the tarmac, turning the airplane cabin into a humid, bustling corridor of tension. Passengers shuffled in, vying for overhead bin space, while flight attendants called out instructions in clipped, rehearsed tones. Lindsay Taylor, a striking blonde in her late 20s, stood at the front of the plane, her practiced smile concealing her growing irritation. It had already been a long day, and they hadn't even left the ground. Toward the back of the plane, Mrs. Opal Tyson carefully navigated the narrow aisle. At 82, her movements were deliberate and labored, her cane clicking softly against the floor with each step. She wore a floral scarf over her silver curls and a powder blue cardigan that hung loosely over her frail shoulders. "Excuse me, sweetheart," Opal said in a voice as warm as fresh biscuits. She had stopped near Lindsay, her small carry-on bag wobbling precariously in her hand. "Could you help me lift this bag into the overhead compartment? My hands don't quite work like they used to." Lindsay turned her head slowly, her polished facade faltering. Her blue eyes flicked to the bag, then back to Opal. "Ma'am," she said with a tight smile, "it's against policy for us to assist with luggage. Passengers are responsible for their own belongings." Opal blinked, confused. "I called ahead, but I couldn't get through to anyone. Lindsay sighed, her frustration barely hidden. The line of passengers behind Opal began to grow restless, murmuring complaints. "Look," Lindsay said in a lower tone, "I'll do it this time, but you really should have arranged assistance earlier. It slows everything down for everyone else." She grabbed the bag and hoisted it into the overhead bin with a brisk, almost dismissive motion. "Thank you, dear," Opal said softly, though her face had fallen. No. Lindsay gave a tight nod and moved on without another word. Behind them, a young black woman seated across the aisle frowned. She leaned over to the man next to her, whispering, "Why'd she have to talk to her like that? It's just a bag." "I don't know," the man muttered. "It didn't sit right with me either." Oblivious to the exchange, Opal settled into her seat, tucking her cane carefully beneath the row in front of her. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted her scarf. She had been flying for decades, visiting family across the country, but this felt different. There was a tension in the air that she couldn't shake. A few rows up, Lindsay stood near the galley, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. The line of passengers had finally cleared, but she could feel their eyes on her, judging her. "What's her problem?" one man muttered loud enough for Lindsay to hear. "She's just doing her job," said another, though his tone carried little conviction. Lindsay glanced toward the back of the plane, where Opal now sat quietly by the window, her hands folded in her lap. "She should have known better," Lindsay muttered under her breath, though she couldn't help feeling a twinge of guilt. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the murmur of discontent among the passengers didn't dissipate. Instead, it seemed to build, simmering just below the surface. Several people exchanged glances, as if waiting for something else to happen. Opal, oblivious to the growing tension around her, stared out the window at the fading sun. She clasped her hands tightly together, her arthritic fingers trembling slightly. She had long ago learned to endure indignities with grace, but today something felt heavier, like a storm brewing on the horizon. "Are you okay, ma'am?" the young woman across the aisle asked gently. Opal turned to her, startled by the kindness in her voice. "I'm fine, dear," she said softly, though her eyes betrayed her. The woman hesitated, her brows furrowed, before leaning back in her seat. Around them, the cabin buzzed with quiet unrest, passengers watching and waiting, though no one quite knew what they were waiting for. In the cockpit, the captain announced the final checks for departure, but within the cabin, the tension was palpable. What had started as a minor moment of discomfort now loomed large, a storm cloud hanging over the flight, ready to burst. The plane cruised at 35,000 feet, but the atmosphere in the cabin was far from peaceful. Passengers settled into their routines, scrolling through their phones, flipping through in-flight magazines, and adjusting to the cramped seats. Amid the low hum of the engines, a subtle tension lingered, its source unclear to some, but undeniable to others. Mrs. Opal Tyson sat quietly in her seat near the back of the plane, her hands resting on her lap. Her soft blue cardigan and floral scarf gave her an air of calm, but her face betrayed her discomfort. She shifted in her seat, wincing slightly as her back pressed against the hard cushion. When Lindsay passed by on her way down the aisle, Opal gently raised a hand. "Excuse me, miss," she said, her voice just loud enough to carry over the cabin noise. Lindsay stopped, her professional smile already feeling forced. "Yes, ma'am. Could I trouble you for a pillow? My back is giving me a bit of trouble," Opal said, trying to meet Lindsay's eyes. Lindsay hesitated. "We only have a limited supply of pillows, and they're usually reserved for first-class passengers, but I'll check." Her tone was clipped, and the words felt like a lecture more than a response. Lindsay disappeared down the aisle, returning a minute later with a small, thin pillow, which she placed on Opal's lap without much care. "Here you go," Lindsay said tersely. "Thank you, dear," Opal said softly, her hands trembling as she adjusted the pillow behind her. Lindsay didn't respond, walking briskly toward the front of the plane. "Was that necessary?" a voice whispered nearby. It was the young woman sitting across the aisle from Opal, her expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. The man seated next to her, a middle-aged white passenger in a business suit, leaned closer. "What do you mean?" he asked. "She's being rude to her," the woman said quietly but firmly. "That little old lady just needed a pillow." The man shrugged. "Maybe she's just having a bad day." The young woman's frown deepened. "Even so, that's not how you treat people." A few rows forward, Lindsay was unaware of the murmurs behind her. She was focused on managing the rest of the cabin, but she couldn't shake the irritation she felt toward Opal. Everything about the older woman seemed to require extra effort Lindsay wasn't in the mood to give. 15 minutes later, a slight rattle shook the plane as it hit a patch of turbulence. Opal, startled, fumbled with the tray table in front of her, trying to steady it. The latch slipped from her fingers and the tray fell forward, knocking against the seat in front of her. The man in the seat turned around sharply, scowling. "Hey, watch it," he snapped. "I'm so sorry," Opal said, her voice shaky. "I didn't mean to." The commotion caught Lindsay's attention. She hurried down the aisle, her face set in a mask of professionalism that barely concealed her growing annoyance. "Ma'am," Lindsay said curtly as she approached, "please be more careful. You're disturbing other passengers." "It was an accident," Opal said, her tone pleading. "The latch slipped." Lindsay crossed her arms. "Accidents or not, other people paid for their comfort too. Please try to keep your tray table secured." Around them, passengers exchanged disapproving looks. The young woman across the aisle spoke up, her voice firm. "That's uncalled for." She apologized. Lindsay turned to the woman, her eyes narrowing. "Ma'am, I need you to stay out of this. I'll handle it." The woman held up her hands in surrender, but her expression was anything but passive. "Sure, fine. But you're not handling it well." Opal, feeling the heat of so many eyes on her, shrank back into her seat. Her cheeks burned, and her fingers clenched the armrest tightly. Lindsay, aware of the simmering unrest among the passengers, tried to shake off the feeling of eyes boring into her back as she walked away. In her seat, Opal stared out the window, her vision blurred by tears she refused to let fall. All her life, she'd prided herself on her resilience, her ability to endure indignities with grace. But something about today, the sharpness of Lindsay's words, the judgment in the other passengers' eyes, felt heavier. And the young woman across the aisle leaned toward her again. "Are you okay?" Opal forced a smile and nodded. "I'm fine, dear. Don't worry about me." But inside, a storm was brewing, and it wasn't just turbulence. It was the kind of storm born from years of quiet endurance, one that wouldn't be calm so easily. The plane hummed steadily as it continued its journey, but the tension in the cabin had grown thicker with each passing minute. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the earlier exchanges between Opal and Lindsay lingering in the air like a bad odor. For most, it was just an undercurrent, a discomfort they couldn't quite name. For Opal, it was a weight pressing on her chest. It began innocently enough. Opal needed her medication. Her hands, arthritic and weak, had trouble navigating the small zipper on her carry-on under the seat in front of her. She struggled for a moment before deciding to stand, gripping the back of the seat in front of her for support. Across the aisle, the young woman from earlier noticed and quickly stood to help. "Do you need me to grab something for you?" she asked gently. "Oh, I just need my pills, dear," Opal said, smiling gratefully. "They're in my bag." But before the young woman could respond, Lindsay appeared out of nowhere, her steps brisk and her voice sharp. "Ma'am, you need to remain seated." Startled, Opal froze. "I just needed to get my medication." "We've been over this," Lindsay interrupted. "Passengers must stay seated unless absolutely necessary. You've been up several times already." Opal's lips trembled. "I didn't mean to cause trouble, but my hands don't." "It doesn't matter," Lindsay snapped, cutting her off again. "This is a safety issue. If you can't follow the rules, you shouldn't be flying alone." The words hung in the air like a slap. Nearby passengers audibly gasped. "Wait, what?" the young woman across the aisle said, standing up fully now. "Are you serious? She's just trying to take her meds." "Ma'am," Lindsay said, glaring at the young woman, "I'm not going to ask you again to stay out of this. Sit down." "No, I'm not sitting down," the young woman shot back. "You're being rude to her for no reason. She hasn't done anything wrong." By now, murmurs had spread throughout the cabin. Passengers leaned into the aisle, craning their necks to see what was happening. "I have to follow protocol," Lindsay said firmly, though a faint quiver in her voice betrayed her discomfort. "This is about safety." "Safety?" the young woman retorted, gesturing toward Opal. "She's an elderly woman with arthritis. How is she a threat to safety?" Lindsay's face flushed red. She turned back to Opal, her tone icy. "I'm going to have to ask you to remain seated for the rest of the flight. If you can't comply, I'll be forced to call security when we land." Opal looked up at Lindsay, her eyes wide and filled with shame. "Please," she whispered. "I've done nothing wrong." "You're disrupting the flight," Lindsay insisted. The murmurs grew louder, and a man from a few rows up stood. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You're singling her out for no reason." "Everyone, please remain calm," Lindsay said, raising her hands defensively. "I need to maintain order." "What you need to do," the man replied angrily, "is apologize to her." At that moment, a teenage boy further down the plane held up his phone, recording the interaction. "This is crazy," he muttered to the passenger next to him. "They're kicking her off, aren't they?" Lindsay noticed the phone, and her expression hardened. "Sir, put that phone away. Filming is not allowed on board." "Yeah, right," the teenager said, smirking. "It's allowed when there's public safety involved." Passengers chuckled nervously, the mood in the cabin shifting from discomfort to outright rebellion. Lindsay, overwhelmed and increasingly flustered, turned to leave. "I'll be reporting this to my supervisor," she said. "We'll be landing soon." As she walked away, the young woman across the aisle sat back down, shaking her head in disbelief. "Unbelievable," she muttered. Opal stared at her hands, her shoulders hunched. She had never felt so small, so humiliated. "Don't worry," the young woman said softly. "We've got your back." But Opal didn't respond. She was too tired, too worn down. All she could do was wait, hoping the nightmare would soon be over. For everyone else, though, it was clear. The situation wasn't ending anytime soon. A confrontation was brewing, and the storm that had been simmering for hours was about to break wide open. As the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the plane's descent into Denver for a scheduled stop, the tension in the cabin had reached its peak. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their collective disapproval simmering below the surface. Mrs. Opal Tyson sat motionless in her seat, her frail hands clasped tightly over her lap. The earlier confrontation with Lindsay had left her shaken, her dignity chipped away piece by piece. She could feel the stares of the other passengers, not of blame, but of pity, and it stung just as much. Lindsay appeared at the front of the cabin, her face set in a mask of authority. She spoke briefly with another flight attendant before making her way toward the back of the plane. Every step she took seemed heavier than the last as the discontent of the passengers pressed down on her. Stopping by Opal's row, Lindsay knelt slightly to meet the elderly woman's eyes. "Ma'am," she said, her tone clipped but quieter than before, "you'll need to deplane at Denver. We can't continue with you being disruptive to the flight." Gas rippled through the cabin. Opal's face paled. "Deplane?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "But why? I didn't mean any harm. Please, I'm just trying to get to New York. I'm sorry, Lindsay said, though her tone carried no warmth. We can arrange for assistance to help you get on another flight. You're kicking her off, the young woman across the aisle exclaimed, standing up again. Her voice was loud enough to draw the attention of nearly everyone in the cabin. This is outrageous, the man in the business suit chimed in. She hasn't done anything wrong. Lindsay straightened, trying to maintain control. Sir, I need you to remain seated. This is a matter of safety and protocol. Protocol? The young woman shot back. What protocol are you following that says humiliating an elderly woman is okay? By now, several other passengers had joined in, their voices rising in protest. A middle-aged couple in the row behind Opal shook their heads in disgust. She's somebody's grandmother, the wife muttered loudly. She's my grandmother, a voice suddenly growled from behind Lindsay. All heads turned as a tall, broad-shouldered man stood up in the aisle, his face partially obscured by a hoodie. His presence was commanding, his tone sharp enough to silence the murmurs. Wait, a passenger whispered, squinting. Is that Mike Tyson? Lindsay froze, her face draining of color. The man pulled back his hood, revealing the unmistakable features of the heavyweight boxing legend. His jaw was tight, his eyes burning with fury as he stared Lindsay down. You're kicking my grandma off this plane? Mike Tyson said, his voice low but brimming with controlled anger. Lindsay stammered, completely caught off guard. I didn't realize... You didn't realize what? Tyson shot back. That the little old lady you've been disrespecting all flight is my family? Or that people are watching how you treat her? Passengers erupted into murmurs, some pulling out their phones to record the confrontation. Lindsay's composure crumbled under the scrutiny, and her polished professionalism faltered. I'm just following policy, Lindsay said weakly, her words sounding hollow. No, Tyson said, his voice rising. You're hiding behind policy to treat people like they don't matter. She's an old woman, not a threat to anybody. You owe her an apology. The cabin fell silent, all eyes on Lindsay. She stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to respond. But before she could say anything, Opal placed a hand on Tyson's arm. Michael, she said softly, her voice trembling. It's okay. Let's just go. I don't want to cause more trouble. Mike's expression softened as he looked down at his grandmother, her small frame seeming even smaller in the moment. Grandma, you didn't do anything wrong, he said gently. I know, baby, Opal said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, but I'm tired. Let's just go. Tyson nodded reluctantly, his jaw clenching as he turned back to Lindsay. This isn't over, he said simply, his tone carrying an unspoken warning. As Opal slowly rose from her seat, leaning on her cane, several passengers began to clap. The applause was not for Lindsay or the airline, but for Opal, for her grace in the face of humiliation, and for enduring what many believed was blatant discrimination. You're a class act, ma'am, one passenger said as Opal passed. Take care, Grandma, another added, their tone filled with warmth. Opal smiled faintly, though the sadness in her eyes remained. With Tyson by her side, she shuffled down the aisle, her dignity intact despite the ordeal. As they exited the plane, the teenage boy with the phone muttered, This is gonna blow up online. Watch. And he was right. The video hit social media before Mike Tyson and Mrs. Opal Tyson even left the Denver airport. It started with a single tweet. Elderly woman kicked off a flight for disrupting while trying to take her medication. Turns out she's Mike Tyson's grandmother. Watch this. Attached was the video, recorded by the teenage boy, showing Lindsay's confrontation with Opal and Tyson's fiery defense. Within minutes, it spread like wildfire. By the time they reached the airline's customer service desk, the hashtags Year Justice for Opal and On Discrimination in the skies were already trending worldwide. Opal sat quietly in a wheelchair provided by airport staff, her small frame looking even smaller as she stared down at her folded hands. The humiliation of the experience lingered in her chest, though she tried to bury it. Meanwhile, Tyson was pacing, his phone pressed against his ear. No, this isn't about money, he growled into the receiver. It's about respect. They treated her like she didn't matter. He ended the call and glanced at Opal, his face softening. "Grandma, are you sure you're okay?" "I'll be fine, Michael," Opal said with a weary smile. "I've been through worse in my day." Tyson knelt beside her, taking her hand. "You shouldn't have to keep going through it. Not now. Not ever." Their quiet moment was interrupted by an airline representative who approached cautiously, her face pale and tight. "Mr. Tyson, Mrs. Tyson," she began nervously, "on behalf of the airline, I want to deeply apologize for what happened on your flight. We're reviewing the situation and will take immediate action." "Don't apologize to me," Tyson interrupted. "Apologize to her and to every other person you've treated this way." The woman opened her mouth, but before she could speak, Tyson's phone buzzed with a notification. He glanced at the screen, his brows furrowing. "It's everywhere," he muttered. Opal tilted her head. "What's everywhere?" Tyson showed her the phone, where dozens of videos and posts about the incident flooded his feed. Celebrities were retweeting the video, news outlets were picking up the story, and comments were pouring in by the thousands. "They kicked Mike Tyson's grandmother off a plane? This is heartbreaking and infuriating. Shakespeare justice for Opal. Elderly black woman humiliated on a flight. The airline needs to answer for this." As the videos gained traction, reporters began contacting Tyson for interviews. Civil rights organizations issued statements condemning the airline, while others dug up previous incidents involving similar treatment of elderly or marginalized passengers. Opal watched the chaos unfold on the screen, her face a mixture of surprise and unease. "Michael, I don't need all this attention," she said softly. "It's not just about you, Grandma," Tyson replied. "It's about making sure no one else goes through this." At that moment, a young black woman approached them cautiously. It was the same passenger who had defended Opal during the flight. She held a nervous but determined expression. "Mrs. Tyson?" she asked. Opal smiled warmly. "Yes, dear. I just wanted to say I'm so sorry for what happened, and thank you for staying so strong. You inspired me, and a lot of other people on that flight." Tyson stood and shook the woman's hand. "Thank you for having her back," he said sincerely. The woman blushed but nodded. "It was the least I could do. We all saw what was happening, and it wasn't right." As the young woman walked away, Tyson turned back to Opal. "See?" he said, grinning. "You're inspiring people already." Opal chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I didn't do anything, Michael." "You showed grace when they tried to tear you down," Tyson replied. "That's not nothing." By the time their replacement flight was ready, the airline's CEO had issued a public apology, and Lindsay's name was trending along with the hashtags. But for Opal, the whirlwind of attention was just beginning. What had started as a humiliating experience had become a rallying cry for respect and dignity, a story that was quickly becoming bigger than anyone could have anticipated. Lindsay sat in the stark, cold office of her airline's corporate headquarters, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Across from her sat her supervisor, a stern-looking man in a gray suit who hadn't stopped frowning since she entered the room. The tension in the small space was suffocating. "Do you understand the gravity of what happened?" her supervisor asked, his voice low but brimming with barely restrained anger. "Yes, sir," Lindsay replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you?" he pressed, leaning forward. "Because in the last 24 hours, we've received over 40,000 complaints. The video of you confronting Mrs. Tyson has been viewed more than 10 million times. Public figures, activists, even celebrities are calling us out by name. Our shareholders are demanding answers, and our PR team is in full crisis mode." Lindsay's face flushed with embarrassment, her carefully maintained composure unraveling. She had watched the video herself over and over, and each time it made her stomach churn. She hadn't realized in the moment how cruel her words had sounded or how dismissive her actions had been. "She was being disruptive," Lindsay said weakly, though even she didn't believe the words anymore. Her supervisor's eyes narrowed. "An elderly woman with arthritis trying to take her medication is disruptive?" He shook his head in disbelief. "You humiliated her in front of an entire cabin of passengers, and then you kicked her off the flight. Do you have any idea what kind of message that sends?" "I didn't mean..." Intent doesn't matter, Lindsay, he snapped, slamming his hand on the desk. What matters is how you made her feel, how you made everyone on that plane feel, and how you've damaged this company's reputation. Lindsay flinched at his tone, tears welling in her eyes. I didn't realize she was Mike Tyson's grandmother, she mumbled. The supervisor groaned, rubbing his temples. That's not the point. It doesn't matter who she's related to. She deserved respect simply because she's a human being. But you saw an elderly black woman and dismissed her, didn't you? Lindsay opened her mouth to protest but stopped. She didn't have an answer, at least not one that would exonerate her. She trailed off, looking down at her hands. I guess I wasn't thinking. No, her supervisor said sharply. You weren't, and now we're all paying the price. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city skyline. Here's what's going to happen. Effective immediately, you're suspended without pay. Pending the outcome of this investigation, your employment will be reviewed. Lindsay's breath caught in her throat. Suspended, she whispered. You should consider yourself lucky you're not already fired, he said coldly, turning back to face her. But we're still deciding how to handle this. In the meantime, I suggest you reflect on how you got here. Lindsay nodded numbly, her face pale. As she stood to leave, her supervisor added, and if you care about salvaging your career, you'd better start with a genuine apology. Not to me, not to the media, but to Mrs. Tyson. And it better come from the heart. That evening, Lindsay sat alone in her small apartment, scrolling through her phone. The backlash was relentless. Thousands of angry comments on every social media platform, people calling her out by name, demanding accountability. But amid the criticism, she found something else. Stories. People were sharing their experiences of being mistreated on flights, of being dismissed because they were elderly, disabled, or a person of color. She read stories from Black passengers who felt invisible, from elderly travelers who were shamed for asking for help. She read one comment that stuck with her. We don't need more apologies. We need people to actually care. Start there. For the first time, Lindsay stopped feeling defensive and started feeling something else. Shame, yes, but also a deep, gnawing sense of responsibility. She had been so focused on enforcing rules that she hadn't seen the person in front of her. She couldn't undo what she'd done, but maybe, just maybe, she could learn from it. Weeks later, Mrs. Opal Tyson stood at the front of a packed room at a senior advocacy center in New York City. The once quiet grandmother had found a new voice in the wake of her ordeal, and it resonated with the community. Behind her, a banner read, "Dignity in the Skies, advocating for the elderly and marginalized travelers." Opal clutched the microphone tightly as she looked out over the crowd. What happened to me on that plane wasn't just about me, she said, her voice steady but passionate. It's about how we see people, how we treat people who don't fit into a box of convenience or power. The audience nodded and clapped, their energy fueling her resolve. I didn't think my story would matter to so many, Opal continued, but I'm glad it did, because no one should feel invisible. No one should be made to feel like they don't belong. She paused, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on someone sitting near the back, a familiar blonde woman clutching a bouquet of white lilies. Lindsay Taylor sat nervously, her shoulders hunched and her hands trembling as she clutched the flowers. She had thought about coming to this event for days, unsure if she'd even be welcome, but something in her heart told her it was the right thing to do. When Opal finished her speech, the crowd erupted into applause, many standing to their feet. Opal smiled graciously and stepped down, greeting attendees who lined up to thank her for her words. Lindsay hung back, waiting until the room had mostly cleared before approaching. Mrs. Tyson? Lindsay's voice was barely above a whisper. Opal turned, her expression calm but unreadable. Yes, dear? Lindsay swallowed hard, clutching the bouquet tighter. I wanted to apologize. For everything. The way I treated you on the plane, it was wrong. I see that now, and I'm so sorry. Opal regarded her silently for a moment, her gaze steady. Then she gestured to a nearby bench. Come sit with me, she said. Lindsay hesitated but obeyed, lowering herself onto the bench. She placed the flowers on the table between them, her fingers fidgeting nervously. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what I did, Lindsay began, "and I know I can't take it back, but I want to learn. I want to do better. Seeing how much pain I caused you, it made me realize how blind I've been to the way I treat people." Opal studied her carefully. "And what have you learned?" "That people are more important than rules," Lindsay said quickly. "That my job isn't just about following a checklist, it's about showing kindness, especially to those who need it most." Opal nodded slowly, a faint smile playing at her lips. "That's a good start, dear. But it's not just about kindness. It's about seeing people, recognizing their humanity, even when it's inconvenient. Do you understand that?" Lindsay nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I do. I really do." The older woman patted her hand gently. "Then you have work to do, but I accept your apology." Relief washed over Lindsay, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she whispered. The two women sat in silence for a moment, the tension between them dissolving into something softer. Around them, the room buzzed with conversations, laughter, and the energy of change. In the months that followed, Opal's advocacy work gained momentum. She became a sought-after speaker, using her story to highlight the systemic mistreatment of elderly and marginalized travelers. Her grandson, Mike Tyson, continued to amplify her voice, ensuring her message reached far and wide. As for Lindsay, she didn't stop at an apology. She attended workshops on racial bias, enrolled in sensitivity training programs, and began volunteering at the same senior advocacy center where she first approached Opal. She wanted her actions to reflect the lessons she learned, not just her words. One day, as she helped an elderly man navigate the center's resources, Lindsay spotted Opal across the room. Their eyes met, and Opal gave her a small, encouraging nod. It wasn't forgiveness alone that had brought Lindsay to this point. It was the understanding that forgiveness came with responsibility, and she was determined to honor that. Through their separate paths, both women turned the pain of their shared experience into something powerful. And while the skies might not have been entirely clear, they had taken a meaningful step toward a world where everyone could fly with dignity. Thank you so much for watching this story. Your support means everything to us. If you enjoyed it and want to see more inspiring stories like this, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear from you. What time are you watching this video, and where are you tuning in from? Drop a comment below and let us know. It's always amazing to see how far our community reaches. And remember, every share, like, or comment helps us spread these powerful stories to more people. Thanks for being part of this journey, and we'll see you in the next one.